Hello, folks. Welcome again to another edition of the Tom's Hardware Show, the last edition of the year. Today, we're talking about the sort of best consumer tech of 2021, and then sort of seeing off the year as we go into a new one. Before that, let's run the thing. So, hello, folks. Thanks again for joining us for another edition of the Tom's Hardware Show. As always, I am your host, Michelle Earhart, and joining me today is our editor-in-chief, Avram Pilch, and our managing editor, Matt Safford. How's it going, guys?
Not too bad.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I'm so excited to be on the show with you. It's just amazing the work that you do every week here. So it's an honor for me to be a guest.
Aw, thank you. It's great to have you too. If you watch the channel on Tuesdays, Avram is on the Pi-cast there where he talks about everything Raspberry Pi. But today he's joining us to talk about sort of the rest of consumer tech. So like I said, this is the last show of the year, and we're sort of talking about the best tech of 2021. We've written an article about it. We can bring up honorable mentions. We can take questions. But before we get into that, just like off the cuff, what's your favorite, piece of tech that you played with in 2021? It doesn't even have to be something that came out this year.
That's a good question. I mean, it's hard. I don't know. It's so like our jobs are like constantly, churning through stuff, right? So especially things that we reviewed, it's hard to to think about. I mean, I don't know. You offered up the opportunity of like something we haven't reviewed. I mean, something that's been great for me in this last year is I about a year ago, a little over a year ago, probably, I bought a 4K ViewSonic projector, and for a long time of not going to the movies, having basically my entire bedroom wall as a movie screen was pretty great. And it's also kind of hilarious to watch YouTube and shows like this show like on like 100-inch screen. So
right. So I actually think I'll join you there. This year I got the LG C1 OLED TV, which is like the big sort of primo gaming panel they have. And that's because this year I also got a PS5, which would probably be my actual answer for my favorite tech that I use this year. But it's like probably the first proper home theater-esque thing I have. And I absolutely love it. And it is very silly to watch like chunky potato quality YouTube videos on it. But it's great for nature documentaries.
Yes. As I have one too. I'm looking at it right now.
My favorite thing that I played with this year is a 3D printer. So because this is the year that at Tom's Hardware we got into doing 3D printers, and I personally got into using 3D printers. So one 3D printer I have right here next to me, you can't see on camera, so I'll move over a little bit, is I didn't clean it up for the camera, but is a FlashForge Adventurer 3 Lite printer. Our writer reviewed and really liked a lot. Another one that's right directly behind me is the Elegoo Neptune 2. Both of these are very affordable. The Adventurer Lite is about $270, and the Neptune 2 is actually usually on sale for under $200. It's been a lot of fun with me and my son using these 3D printers to print models, to print little tools and such. Here's like a little wrench we printed. So that's been the most interesting thing for me this year, is getting into the whole world of 3D printing. Now on our best list, we have a different model of printer, the Voxlab Aries, which is also a really great printer that we highly recommend for kids and adults. It's definitely a different step things to think about when you have kids or pets in the house, because you want to make sure that they're not sticking their fingers where the hot melting plastic goes. So an enclosed printer is a huge plus. Like this one is enclosed, right? You can't, I mean, my daughter can sort of pry this open if she really wants to, but at least it's not so easy to get in there. So the Voxlab Aries, which we really like a lot, also an enclosed printer, also has Wi-Fi, which is something a lot of 3D printers don't. Most 3D printers still require you to put something on either a micro SD card or a USB stick and copy and like sneaker net your 3D printing file over. The Voxlab Aries and this Adventurer 3 Lite both let you send your prints over Wi-Fi, which is great. So I highly recommend folks get into 3D printing. It is very, very easy now. It is very inexpensive now. So there's a lot you can do. You don't have to make your own models. You can go to a site like thingiverse.com where there are lots of pre-made models and you can make some neat stuff there. You can make tools, you can make things that you can make cases for things, and you can just make cute stuff. Although most of my cute stuff is in another room, but nevertheless,
I know that your son is very into Mario, and you were showing us a Luigi you made that you were very proud of.
Yes,
What's that though?
This is another Mario character. Can you figure out which one it is? I think it's called Beepo.
Beepo?
Yeah.
I played Odyssey and I don't know what that is.
The guy looks like a hockey puck bunny.
Okay.
We printed this one because it was a good test print because it only took like half an hour. That's one of those things that 3D printing takes a really long time. So if you've got a big model, it could take you 10, 12, 14 hours. So if you just want to see how something comes out, you want to pick a really small model like this just to see how the filament works. So we've been experimenting with different filaments that you can use. For folks who don't know, there's two main kinds of 3D printers. There's what are called FDM, fusion deposit modeling printers, and those use the rolls of filament. And then you have ones that are called SLA printers that use resin, but the resin printers I would not recommend to someone who's a beginner or has any pets or children, because there's a lot of noxious chemicals involved there. You've got to pour these chemicals, and then even after the printing is done, you've got to wash and cure your models. So SLA printers can give you a little bit better quality on some of the models, but but the amount of hassle and danger is it's definitely not worth it for someone who might have a kid or a kid in the house. But anyway, so it's been fun trying different types of filaments, the different materials. This one here is made out of PET G, which is a more flexible, not totally flexible, but a little bit more flexible material than the typical PLA material that most people use. So it's been fun.
I actually have a viewer question already, and I think you've already told like all the ways in which this isn't true for you, but is a 3D printer the type of thing that, you buy, you use for a month, you're like, ooh, fun, and then you forget about it, like an Instapot or an air fryer?
To be fair,
I use my air fryer all the time. I used it to make lunch.
It certainly could be. I haven't printed anything in a couple of weeks, but there's a lot of fun things to do with it, but you have to figure out what it is that you want to do with it. Obviously, some folks are doing more than others, right? If you're just going to print out cheap toys all the time, then you might get bored. Like, hey, no toy I made with this is nearly as cool as like something I could buy for a couple of dollars. But the idea that, hey, maybe there's a piece of my robot part that broke, and maybe I can print it to replace it. Maybe I need like a little tiny tool and I can print it right now. The immediacy of getting things with your 3D printer is pretty cool. And yeah, it's something that for sure you have to find use cases for it. And if you don't have use cases for it, it could end up sitting around taking up desk space. But It depends. If you're into if you're a hobbyist, you're into doing things with Raspberry Pi, maybe there are many cases you might want to print with it. So it's really good to have around. Obviously, it's a different tech task than a lot of people are doing if they're just playing games on their PC.
I mean, I've always kind of thought, I know you've tempted to you've said you could send me a 3D printer before, and like, as someone who's been around tech since they, kind of first become prevalent, I've always been interested in them, but I've always kind of thought like, if I had one, I would also want a good like 3D scanner, because the things that I would like to do is like, I mean, you think of like, the blinds behind me and like the metal brackets that often break and things like that, where like often like there's a piece of plastic that would be very, that you need for something that breaks. And if you could just scan it and print another one, that would be really handy. Right. So I think I would want some kind of way to, scan a real world object so that I could print it.
Yeah,
I have a 3D printer.
No question. This benefits people more if they know how to use 3D modeling software, or they can scan something, because then you can take it beyond just reproducing stuff that you've seen somebody upload to Thingiverse. So, yes, I mean, there's somewhat of a commitment to learning how to do things if you really want to get the most out of it.
It's funny. I learned how to use Maya in grad school, which is a 3D modeling program. But that was for the purpose of like video games. And then I was working another job before this, and I told them I could 3D model, and they were like, "Oh, great! You can do 3D printer stuff for us." It's like, I don't know if the stuff I make can like work in reality. It's weird to think of 3D modeling programs as things you can use to make real stuff now.
Yeah, absolutely, you can. I think the one big downside with anything that you model is 3D printing is still largely monochrome, right? So, this is all green, this is all black, and the others, and for the most part, you can only print in one color. Granted, I have somewhere behind me a filament roll that is rainbow colored, but that doesn't mean you actually pick the color you want. It just sort of churns through and gives you a slight change of color every few feet of filament. So the reason why that matters for your 3D modeling is if something is not visually apparent by having, let's say, like a groove, like, you got eyes on something, but the eyes aren't sticking out, there's something that you would normally paint on, then you've got to, take a hard right turn into crafting
Mm-hmm.
and get some paint, some primer, and paint it, at which point you've moved beyond even 3D printing and into painting models, which
I would love to see 3D printers reach the point. You can see I have a case behind me with a bunch of Gundams,
right.
mobile suits. But what they do is they come in like runners with a bunch of different monochrome plastic pieces on them, and there are different runners for each color, and then you cut them out and put them together. And I was talking with my boyfriend who's built most of those, only built a few of them. And I'm like, do you think 3D printers have gotten to the point where you could print out all the individual pieces you need and then put them together? And we agreed they're probably not at that point yet. Like, they're probably not structurally sound enough where you can build a robot that fits together and doesn't fall apart. But I would love to like be able to make custom parts for model kits using a 3D printer.
I think you could. I do think you could actually. Your biggest problem would be the two biggest problems, and not to hijack our show in terms of 3D printing, the Tom Tarver 3D printing show. Your two biggest problems would be, is it a single color, or do you need to paint it? And then supports. So one of the things that, depending on what you print, it may need to have supports. So if it's got something that's overhanging more than, I think, about 60 degrees, it's recommended that you have the printer print like a little piece of plastic that's called a support that holds it up. So you've got to rip, so that, because it keeps it from drooping and falling over during the printing process. Then when you're done, you've got to take out a wire cutter and cut off all those supports. And they, in my experience, they always leave a little residue behind that's very annoying. So that's those are the problems that you would run into. But there's probably a lot of parts that you could reasonably 3D print. You would still, are they better than molding than somebody in a factory doing it with a mold? Probably not, because you would probably see layer lines and things like that you wouldn't see in something that came from the factory. But you could get a pretty, depending on how much effort you were willing to put into, say, painting it or sanding it, you could probably get a pretty decent.
I already sand them a little bit, because when you nip something off a runner,
Yep.
it leaves a little residue. But not to turn this into the modeling show, but I'm curious. I might have to try this at some point, because I started using Raspberry Pis this year too, on the recommendation of Avram. And I actually got to the point where I set up my Raspberry Pi, and my boyfriend who lives with me was so jealous of mine that he went out on Black Friday to Micro Center and bought one of his own. So I've already been corrupted once. I might be corrupted twice over.
I can almost literally see that story warming Avram's heart.
He asked me for an air quality carbon monoxide detector for his Raspberry Pi for Christmas. He's in the other room, so I can't say whether or not I got it for him, but that is the level that we've reached.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Yeah. I just wonder what there's a lot of air quality filter things out there for people. And I always wonder what you're going to do with that information once you have it. Are you going to be like, we got to move?
Well, my wife bought one for her classroom. She's a high school teacher, and she just wanted to know, is the air quality, good enough without having to keep the windows open all the time? And it was surprisingly better than she thought. So
he just sent me a message. Oh, he says carbon dioxide, not monoxide. Okay.
Either way, what will you do if it's too much? I guess you could get a air purifier or something for the room.
But I guess he's
windows.
Not worried about radon this high up in an apartment building in New York. But anyway, best tech of 2021. Thanks to listening to our preamble. But we do actually have a list here as well that we've put together, where we've chosen our sort of best picks across different categories. And I thought it would be fun to sort of go down this list. We're not going to read the article to you. That would maybe be a little bit weird, but we could talk about our honorable mentions, or why we chose the things we did, or take questions about them. So I thought I'd go ahead and start off with best CPU. This year we said that the best CPU was Intel Alder Lake, which I think is the first time that we've awarded that we sort of awarded something to Intel as opposed to Ryzen.
For a while, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think, after about the second generation of Ryzen, AMD, and again, someone who's been covering this for so long, AMD was a distant second place for a long time. And then, Ryzen kind of surprised everyone and, had a lot of potential. And then about second gen, started getting a lot closer to parity with Intel. And then third, and fourth/fifth, I mean, they basically had surpassed Intel, and in most ways. I mean, there are a lot of different ways and different things people do with their CPUs, right? But particularly for gaming, and the fifth gen of Ryzen, Intel was second fiddle, definitely. And with Alder Lake, it's interesting. They have this two new architectures combined in a sort of almost ARM-like big and little core set, where you have performance cores and efficiency cores. And you wouldn't think just sort of off the cuff that would make a huge difference, but I mean, that I think combined with the fact that they have two new architectures, so just they have retaken the gaming crown. And depending on how you configure, they're pretty competitive on price, as long as you're not factoring in the current insanely high price of DDR5 in that. But there are a bunch of boards that support DDR4 as well, and at least for now, most of the benchmarks show that there's not a major difference between DDR4 and DDR5. So unless you feel like you need to have the newest, bestest thing, you can go with DDR4 and get a very good system, very good gaming rig, for a price that is, depending on how you do it, possibly better than a comparable Ryzen setup. So
I feel like that efficiency core, performance core thing is a thing that Ryzen is going to have to copy going into the future if they want to take back the crown. But we do have a comment here, which brings up a very good point. I think our response to this is probably that just like Intel, like you said, takes the gaming crown. But Javier Perea says, I don't get how Alder Lake took the best CPU over Apple M1. It really looks like ARM processors are the future. To be honest, I was kind of impressed by the M1. I'm impressed by all these ARM processors that we've been seeing that are in-house coming out. And I feel like the M1 was sort of like the herald of that. And I'm curious to see where that goes into the future.
For sure. I mean, as you'll see if we get far enough down this list, there is an M1 Max CPU as part of a product on this list. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely tons of potential, and whether you're an Apple fan or not, there's no denying that what Apple has done with ARM is extremely impressive. So, both Intel and AMD have their work cut out for them. I mean, I think they are x86 is challenged in a way that it hasn't been for longer than I've been paying attention to tech. So yeah, it'll be interesting, but it's like for now it's just on Apple products, right? So
yeah. And what Intel did here is pretty unique in that it brought this hybrid architecture to the x86 desktop. The M1 is proprietary to Apple products, but yes, it is a very impressive CPU, and we know that ARM CPUs continue to get more and more competitive when it comes to high performance. What Intel is doing here is, instead of using the big little philosophy of having low power cores and high power cores to save battery life on a laptop, Intel is using it to really boost performance where you need it on the desktop. And that's something we have not seen the x86 world before. So that's why I think what Intel did is groundbreaking for that ecosystem. It does not seem like, first of all, Apple is kind of in its own ecosystem. And so, yes, it's very impressive, but that is not going to change the game for PC. Apple's M1 is not going to change the game for PC gaming anytime soon. So what we're seeing, though, is that Alder Lake is changing the game for PC gaming and for a lot of workstation-like projects.
Well,
now, I will say that one issue with Alder Lake, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead.
I will say one issue with Alder Lake is it currently runs best on Windows 11 because the thread scheduling isn't up to speed so much on Windows 10, which I think is kind of a pretty big issue for me because I really don't want to upgrade to Windows 11 at that point. That's another big thing that
Windows
came out
11
this year.
Did not make the list.
So
Notable
maybe
in
it'll
its
get better at
absence.
some point, but that is one thing hamstringing you if you go for Alder Lake.
Windows 11 did not make the list. We did not have any debate about putting Windows 11 on the list because nobody really likes Windows 11 that much.
I was actually going to move forward and talk about that M1 Max thing that Matt hinted at earlier. But actually, while we're talking about tech of 2021, let's talk about Windows 11 because that's a big thing that came out this year. And I feel like, Avram, you're the one of us that covered that the most, right?
Yeah. It's not the worst thing that's ever happened to Windows.
It's better than Vista.
I don't know. At least with Vista, they were really trying to do something. Yeah, I agree with Raphael in the chat room that it should be optional. Technically speaking, it is optional. And
for now,
there's definitely you can imagine that as companies, software vendors, hardware vendors have to keep supporting new products going forward, that there may be advantages to being on the latest version of the OS. There usually it are advantages to being on the latest version of the OS. I don't like Windows 11 particularly because it's change for change's sake, and in my opinion, not a good change when it comes to the UI. They've taken away some functionality. It's harder to do certain kinds of customizations that you used to be able to do, like, for example, moving the taskbar to the top or the left or the right. Uh, the information density is less. There's a lot of empty space on, for example, the start menu, and then it's constantly making you go to open additional menus that you don't, rather than keeping you in the same place. Now, what's interesting to me is how it's a pendulum with Windows that uh, Jennifer says her T470S said it can't upgrade to Windows 11. Uh, your T470S is just looking out for your best interest, Jennifer. um, the Although it probably should be able to. Well, I guess it depends on the CPU, but we have an article about how to get around the restrictions if you really want to, but I don't recommend it because there's basically a pendulum of UI that seems to happen with Windows, and it may be happening with other operating systems too, where there's swings. Somebody there's some influence at Microsoft that's like, we want to make it simpler for people, we don't want to confuse people, so let's make everything big like it's Fisher Price and put less information on the screen and treat our users like toddlers. Then lo and behold, people get annoyed, the users get annoyed, and then they swing back to having a reasonable amount of information and customization in the OS, and people say, wow, thank you so much. This is exactly what happened with Windows 7, 8, and 9, right? Vista, I guess it happened. It's like the original Star Trek movies where every other one was good, right? So Vista people didn't like. Now, to be fair, the UI of Vista was perfectly fine. It's that it got, it was slow because it couldn't handle, a lot of hardware couldn't handle the arrow effects. So then Windows 7 came in, and Windows 7 could handle it, and Windows 7 was booted quickly and better performance. All was good. People loved Windows 7. Windows 8 comes. Windows 8 was like if you had a toddler do the UI, or if you thought that only toddlers would use the UI, because instead of having a start menu, they had the start screen with the tiles on it. And the idea was, it's the same as your start menu, but we're going to cover over your screen. And we don't really want you to have windows that you drag around. We just want you to have like one thing open and maybe draw.
Because that was also peak Windows tablets, right?
Right.
When everybody was trying to sell tablets, especially like there were like a bunch of like 8-inch Windows tablets that they thought like, who wants that? No one.
What we found is even people who have Windows tablets want like the Windows interface, right? So people hated Windows 8. I hated Windows 8. I'll be honest with you. And so then Windows 10 came. In fact, it should have been Windows 9, but they were so embarrassed by Windows 8, they had to make it seem like it was 2 versions better, right? So they bring back Windows 10, which basically has a lot of the same features as Windows 7, a regular start menu, regular windowed operating system, whatever. Some bit of the tiles in the start menu, okay. Then all was good. And now we're going to Windows 11, which they know better than to do a Windows 8 where they just make it all one big screen, but they're doing as much as possible to make you have to sort of shift screens based on what you're doing. So like the thing that I really hate is the search bar, the search box. There's no search box in Windows 11. If you want to search, you gotta click on or hit Window S or whatever, and then it opens up another menu for you to search. I mean, it's not a horrible situation, but anytime you're transported from like one menu to another menu, I just find that jarring and annoying.
Yeah, I I mostly agree with you, but the system I'm staring at right now is a Windows 11 system, and the system in the other room that I do most of my meetings on is Windows 10, and for 95% of the things.
Seems like Abram's getting a phone call.
It's the Windows Mafia is calling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What did you say about us?
Microsoft called to complain.
For 97% of the things that I do, I literally don't even think about it. I mean, I can see that the menu is different, but I still, since Windows 10, I've trained myself to just hit the Windows key and then start typing, and I can still do that with Windows 11, and that's kind of how I navigate most things. So,
I think the big thing that Abram told me that he didn't like, we had a show, the two of us, where we just went through all of Windows 11's big changes, is that the right-click context menu doesn't show you the full menu until you do another click. And that's just emblematic of having to do more for less, right?
Right. It's like, oh, we don't trust you. We don't want to overwhelm you by showing you all of your options. So we're going to make you click to click again. It's so annoying.
They're selling more mice by wearing out the clicks.
Maybe they're selling more replacement fingers.
It's funny. We have a few comments in the chat right now saying I can see people. Raphael Hassel says I can see people jumping ship to Linux after Windows 10. Cooler Baruhento says Linux Live, love is Linux. But then Javier Perea, who's a frequent viewer, says we use Windows 10 like XP. Any new feature is too complex. I feel like a lot of people just at this point know how they want to use Windows, and constantly upgrading it is just getting in the way. And unfortunately, swapping to Linux isn't a perfect recreation of that for a lot of people, especially if you want a game. But
I mean, the one thing I would say is I've used Linux a lot more over the last few years than I ever did before, and I've gotten so much respect for the Linux desktop.
And I've been using Linux a lot because of my swap to Raspberry Pi, and I like how quickly and easily I can just access things I want to. But I can't imagine testing all the various peripherals I can test on it, especially with their proprietary software.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. For us, we can't use it for everything. But the one thing I will really give to Linux is Linux lets you separate the kernel from the shell really easily. So if you don't like the way your windowed UI looks in Linux, you have a lot of choices. You can very easily change it. So if you don't like the way the Raspberry Pi OS looks, you don't like the thing in the corner or whatever, there are many ways to change it to look different. And Microsoft should take the same approach. But Microsoft does everything it can to lock you into its vision of the UI rather than give you the choice.
I think just building for PCs is hard already because there's so many different hardware options, and you have to make sure your stuff works across all of those, which is part of why it's easier for Apple because they control which hardware their software is attached to. I would love to see something like Windows Anniversary Edition where they have all the different UIs and then you just select with them or select how you want things to look. But I can imagine just accounting for people using a different OS on different hardware would probably be too complex. Matt, it seems like you have thoughts.
No, I like the people talking about, switching to Linux and loving, and Linux is fine. I don't have a ton of experience with Linux, but I've been around long enough to hear kind of every time there's a new version of Windows, everyone's like, now everyone's going to go to Linux. Sure, some people are, but no. It's just, yes, some people will, and that's fine and good for them. But, there's not going to be this mass movement where a major chunk of, the Windows using public is going to suddenly decide to go to Linux.
Your parents probably aren't going to move to Linux.
Yeah, no. And to be honest, neither am I, because I can figure it out, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life figuring stuff out, right? like I know in a very broad sense, I know how Windows works, and I want to spend my life actually getting things done, not figuring out how. I mean, it's like to a certain
It's
extent,
unfortunate how we're kind of in its grasp that way, though, where when it makes these changes that we don't like, we don't have a good alternative.
Yeah, I also think that there's a certain amount of I mean, one of the comments kind of alluded to it too, you know, we're used to using Windows the same way we learned to use it with XP, and like that's probably different like different versions depending on when you started, right? But I think there's a certain level of you know, I'm reminded of, you know, when I was a kid, you know, like hearing my grandmother complain that they moved the like the cereal aisle in the grocery store, and like she's annoyed because like she has to figure out, you know, they like rearrange things and you have to figure things out. Like, I mean, that's part of, you know, making a new OS, right? And you're always gonna annoy some people, but I still think, as I just said, you know, like the vast majority of the things that I need to do in Windows is basically the same in Windows 11 as it is in Windows 10. So I mean, you know, while I might be annoyed once in a while, it's like I'm happy to spend a little bit of time figuring out the changes. Whereas if
We
I
do make a
shift,
site like for hardware nerds, and they're going
this is
to
true.
hardware nerds always love more options, right? But some people like having things curated for them, and it's hard to find the proper balance between those, because even if you know, put the extra options in there but hide them, the curated people will still be like
Well,
confused that they're even there
I mean,
sometimes.
that's part of the issue with any operating system that's designed for a mainstream audience, right? Is that there's a vast swath of expertise and expectations and just what people do with an operating system, and you're trying to make one thing that works for everyone. It's always
Right.
gonna there are always gonna be issues for some people.
But then the problem is if you make your operating system so niche instead of making it mainstream, then there's less of a chance that programs will work on it. And that's part of why I like to use Windows, because I like to game and it's the most stable OS to game on. I mean, you can game on Linux if you know what you're doing. But a certain series by a YouTube channel I won't mention has revealed to me recently that even that comes with its issues, you know?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm thankful this holiday season, as every day, that there are plenty of bugs and confusing things in Windows so that we can write tutorials and people have a need to come visit our website. If everything was easy and everything worked as advertised, then no one would ever need to read our articles. So I guess I can thank Microsoft for giving me the opportunity to write a whole bunch of tutorials on how to hack your registry to solve some of these problems. I invite folks to go check them out on our website.
And then
Of course,
breaking
I
those
created-
tutorials.
Yes, and then breaking those tutorials to keep me busy.
That's a good point. Even if Microsoft doesn't put in the options for you, another nice thing about writing a website for hardcore PC nerds is that they will find a way to put it in for themselves.
Yep.
So on that kind of downer note, let's go back to talking about good things. So Matt mentioned earlier when we were talking that we do have an M1 product on our best of 2021 list, and that is the MacBook Pro 16-inch, which you can get with an M1 Max, which, you know, takes it up to 10-core CPU and 32-core GPU. But a big reason we liked this laptop, and you can see the little sidebar there that you can't do easily on Windows 11. But a big reason we liked this laptop isn't necessarily because of the chip, but it's also like it's finally getting rid of the touch bar. It's making it a little bit thicker for better cooling and better port support. It's just kind of acknowledging that, you know, MacBooks don't necessarily always need to be the sleekest thing on the market. They also need to be, you know, decently powerful, even if that comes at the cost of like lugging them around a little bit heavier. You know, if people were working from home, that's not as much of a problem.
It's the pendulum swinging back for Apple.
Yep.
Like with Microsoft, they're swinging to the Fisher-Price side and trying to make it streamlined because they think it looks cool. Apple did that with the Touch Bar and getting rid of some important ports. And what Apple has seen is that people were annoyed, so they've swung the pendulum back to actually give you more functionality by
It's
giving
so
you the
weird
ports
to
back.
see 2021 kind of show Apple supporting. I mean, it's definitely still the sleek, company that sleek image that it wants to have, but it's weird to see them, pumping out headlining sort of power user features and these big powerful chips while Windows 11 comes out and says like, ooh, centered touch bar and, rounded corners.
Rounded corners. If anybody's upgrading for the rounded corners, I feel really sorry for them. I mean, that's your reason to upgrade is the very subtly rounded corners on the windows.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have a viewer comment here. It looks like a 2008 MacBook. I could see that as a negative comment, but like you said, it's the pendulum swinging back, I think. And I quite appreciate the inclusion of more ports on this, especially. Look, you got a headphone jack there. Isn't that so nice?
Yes, imagine innovating. Imagine in your idea of innovating is to bring back the things that you took away. So I think the next thing that Apple will innovate on and will think that they invented is color. I think we will see. I've been predicting this for like 10 years, so I'm sure I'll be predicting another 10. But the silver design of the MacBook is so old.
Well, they did that with the iMacs. Was that this year? Like they had colorful ones. They've started in that direction. But yeah, they've been a
Bring
company.
back the iBook.
Actually, it's the white plastic that used to be in everything Apple that hasn't made a comeback yet. So we'll see. Maybe that's next.
Bring back the iBook. I always wanted. I'm not a big Apple person, but I always wanted a Bondi Blue iBook or Blueberry iBook. Bring back.
I grew up with the iMac in my school computer labs, and I wanted one growing up. And then I grew up and realized they weren't very good computers, but I love the way they look. But anyway, back to PCs and kind of clipping us along a little bit because we're reaching time and we've only talked about like 3 things.
This is why Avram and I aren't often on the show together.
We should talk about, if we're talking about the tech of 2021, though, we should definitely talk about the graphics cards this year. So we put the RTX 3060 as our best graphics card. Personally, I think that's kind of a controversial choice because I think the big story with the graphics cards this year is that you cannot buy them for the most part. I think the RTX 3060 is probably the one that I've seen like actually available at a decent price the most, which is why I would back this being like the new graphics card that I would say is the best of the year. But another big thing, if we're talking about tech this year, is that tech releases are super staggered now, right? So like something comes out and you're like, okay, I'll get that in 6 months to a year. I'm just now thinking like maybe I should get a 30 series card and the 40 series cards are going to come around, in a few months, right?
Yeah, it's really tough right now. Although I have to say that supply issues are not nearly as bad in any other sector as they are in graphics cards. It was the case, I think, earlier in the year where it was really hard to get a Ryzen 5000 series CPU, but now you can get one.
In fact, they're on sale.
Right. So, like, is it just me, Matt, or is it the case that most components outside of the graphics card you can now get at close to MSRP?
Yeah, pretty much. No, it's graphics cards because graphics cards have 2 problems, right? They have they can't make as many as they would like, and as many as they can make, people are buying to mine with. I mean, that like was a problem with the 10 series cards like 5 years ago. And they were scarce for a while. It wasn't anywhere as bad as it is now. But I mean, when you combine a baked in problem with crypto mining with a global pandemic and supply issues, that you get graphics cards.
Yeah. I mean, that's the main problem. And then you also see it reflected in shortages of gaming consoles. But
Yep.
if you don't want to play any games, you can get your components now.
I mean, it's interesting that, as sort of streaming services have tried, streaming gaming services have tried to proliferate, you'd think if they were ever going to be successful, now is the time. And like, maybe Xbox has been a bit more successful, right? But like we've seen Google with Stadia and Amazon both try to launch streaming gaming services that haven't done very well. So I mean, I just see that as like, if they're not successful now, we have at least another 5 years to wait before, at least streaming PC gaming services get majorly successful, because it's like a perfect storm for them and they're still kind of struggling. So
I mean, like, I feel like the type of person who knows what an RTX 3080 is also the type of person who will want to build their own PC, which is kind of, opposed to the idea of just having a tiny little streaming box and having most of the hardware live on the cloud, right? So like GeForce Now released its RTX 3080 tier this year, which we tested, and for a lot of people, it's probably the best way to game with RTX 3080 right now, without paying a ton. You'll have to do it on a month-to-month basis, but at least you can try it and see how you like it before you pay a bunch of money, especially if you're going to go aftermarket, which I won't judge you for. But but is something that a lot of people will have to do at this point. And we had Jared on talking about that a few shows ago, but until you brought up streaming services right now, to be honest, I kind of forgot that even happened. I had a bad introduction to cloud gaming though, because I tried using OnLive back in the day, and that failed after a few months because it just wasn't up to par.
Somebody needs to bring it all together. I think that's the real problem that's going on with cloud gaming right now. Like GeForce Now, it has really good performance, right? Like you can get really good performance, but you also have to make sure that the game you want to play is supported by it. And then you also have to buy that game. So,
and then you also have to live somewhere where there's really good internet, which I think is a big problem in large portions of this country still.
So I think somebody needs to put it all together where you've got a plan where you can, I mean, there are some free games on these services. There are some free games on GeForce Now and some free games on Stadia, but there ought to be like a true Netflix of gaming where like you can really get games that people really want to play and you can stream them all for one monthly fee and make it easy for people.
I mean, I think that's what Xbox Game Pass Ultimate is trying to be, right? Because Xbox Game Pass, I have issues with it. It, still isn't directly equivalent to just going to the rental store and buying a new game that came out that week, and playing it over the weekend and taking it back is. But it's probably the closest thing you can get to an Xbox or to a Netflix for gaming right now. And now they added the tier where you can get Xbox Cloud Gaming on top of that.
But that's another thing where, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of potential, but you need, unless you're someone who's really paying attention to it, like you needed to explain the tiers and the levels, right? And it's still like, you almost have to have about like, it's like, it requires the same amount of like paying attention to things and figuring things out as like buying a graphics card, right? Like it's not like, oh, I have a Netflix subscription and here's all the things I can watch. It's like, oh, I need to know this exists, and then I need to have this.
I feel like that's the thing, right? Unless it opens up like a new avenue of gaming to you. Like, oh, I can run this game on my phone, and that's something I wasn't able to do before. If it's just a way to play a game that you can already run like on your PC or Xbox, but with slightly higher fidelity, I don't think it's going to work, because the type of people, like I said, who know how to get access to this are already kind of against the idea of cloud gaming, because they like owning their software. They like owning their hardware. They like customizing it. They like also owning their software. And a lot of these services, especially Stadia, are like, okay, you can only buy the game to work with our service.
Well, plus those people who have been paying attention to this for the last decade, as you just pointed out, have seen over and over again this fail, right? So they're like, they've been conditioned to be skeptical about streaming. So like, even if you're open to the idea, like you've probably tried it 2 or 3 times with various services and had a horrible experience, or maybe an experience that wasn't great, but then the service went away, right? So, I mean, I think that there's just kind of like this baked in skepticism for, you know, the sort of enthusiasts or the older gamers that have been through this before, right? That they know at least if they can get a graphics card, like it's going to work. They're going to be with their game.
I agree. I think like, you know, this year, great year for graphics cards theoretically. Like these are some really good components.
It's a good year for
for
the
actually
companies
being
selling
able to get your
graphics
hands
cards.
on them.
Yes.
So which then leads you to streaming services, which I think are still kind of a wild west. But as we reach on time, we are reaching the point in our sort of best of 2021 list where we go through like really granular stuff like, oh, best monitor, best keyboard, best mouse. But we talked about Raspberry Pis earlier, and I want to take advantage of having Avram with us. We put on our best of 2021 list, best Raspberry Pi product, Raspberry Pi Pico. Ooh, you've got it for us right now. So what can you tell us about the Pico, Avram?
I can tell you that I have a lot of them lying around my desk in office. So I didn't even do it to prepare for the show. I just had it like right here. I always have a Pico, always have some amount of boards lying on my desk. Anyway, so the Pico, this is a truly groundbreaking product. And it's not groundbreaking because of the board itself, but this SoC on it, the Raspberry Pi RP2040. This is the first piece of silicon designed by the Raspberry Pi Foundation, but it's different than every other Raspberry Pi that you've ever seen because typically Raspberry Pi, see if I have one on my desk, although it's got stuff on it, but typically a Raspberry Pi looks like this without the wires hanging out of it, right? And you run Linux on it. It's a computer. You could use it as your only computer if you really wanted to. A little slow compared to even a cheap PC, but you could use it as a computer. The RP2040 is designed to be a microcontroller. It competes with the likes of Arduino. So what that means is it doesn't run an operating system on it. It's meant to control various electronics. So it's got a dual core 133 megahertz processor in it. It's got, I think, 256 kilobytes of RAM. So it's not meant to run a whole operating system. What it's meant to do is quickly, easily do things like turn into a game controller, turn into a keyboard, power lights and motors in a robot. No boot up time. You program it in your choice of C or MicroPython or CircuitPython mostly, or Arduino language, and you can use it to power things like this. Here's an Adafruit macro keyboard, right? Called the MacroPad, and inside of it is the same RP2040 processor that's in the Pico. So this is quite a big deal because Raspberry Pi has now waded into and started to make huge headway into the microcontroller market, and its product is better than traditional Arduino. It's more powerful. It gives you more options. So, now it's a Raspberry Pi, but it's not like any other Raspberry Pi that has existed before.
I really like that because, I keep seeing all these Raspberry Pi products or projects, and it's like, yeah, attach a full Raspberry Pi computer just to do this one very specific thing. I'm like, that feels like a little bit of a waste to me. Raspberry Pis, can go up to $100. And they're like tiny little cell phone guts. You can do a lot with them, and you're just gonna, dedicate it to controlling your RC car or whatever.
Right.
You could have an RC car that also plays Nintendo games, but this, you can, I think, more freely use for projects.
And there's a lot you can do with it. Like so and also has some features that the regular Pi doesn't. For example, it has depending on which board you have, because there's the Pico, which is the first party board, but then here I have an Adafruit Feather, which also uses RP2040. You either have 3 or 4 analog to digital pins. So what that means is something like an analog joystick, right? You requires 2 pins for the one for the x-axis and one for the y-axis, right? So you could create a controller that has 2 thumbsticks with one of these, and the analog to digital conversion is handled directly by the RP2040 chip, whereas on a regular Raspberry Pi there's no analog to digital conversion, so you need to get some type of additional chip or hat to do that. So it's definitely a big step forward, and of course people have taken this and run with it. So now there are like little game systems that are based on it, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff that you can do with these, even a little bit of machine learning. So you can actually get these to do a little bit of image or sound recognition, which is just wild from something that is this small and low powered.
Awesome. What is the cost for a Pico, or is it a Pico or a Pico?
I think it's Pico, but
Okay, Pico sounds better to me, even though like it's a Raspberry Pi. But
so I don't know, maybe I could have been getting it wrong this whole time. $4.
$4. That's
Well,
so much less than granted, for a lot of projects, you probably don't need a Raspberry Pi 4 like I have, or a Raspberry Pi 400 like my boyfriend went out and bought.
I
But
mean, to be fair to the marketplace, you can get a Raspberry Pi Zero for $5. But that doesn't. But it may not be as good an idea for your project. You can get a
right.
Raspberry Pi Zero W with Wi-Fi in it for $10. So it's not. You don't have to spend $35, $45, $55 to get $75 to get a
But it's
Raspberry
like
Pi.
an older, slightly larger board that's not like purpose made to be a
Yeah,
microcontroller.
right. Yeah. I
Right.
mean, different tools for different uses.
I'm still hung up on Michelle's idea of having a radio controlled car that like has NES emulation, because I want to like play RC Pro-Am on a little radio controlled car that's also driving around.
Well, I think that's Mario
do it.
Kart World Tour or whatever
I
it is, right?
suppose. Yeah. It's not, I don't know. It's not the same.
So
Doesn't make those sounds.
We are just about on time, but before I leave us for the final show of the year into 2022, because I will be out of town for the next couple of weeks. Avram, Matt, as we move into the next year, what do you want to see, coming out of tech, whether it be GPUs or new Raspberry Pi thing or a new peripheral thing, or AMD learning from Intel with its CPU architecture? Which feels ugly to say, and people will probably hate on me for saying it, but
I mean, I don't know. One of the things that I feel like I'm starting to see, and this will be will not make Avram happy, but I think this past year has been peak RGB. We have seen a few really good cases that don't have any RGB, and actually some of the Z690 motherboards that I've been editing from our reviewer Joe, have like some fairly high end motherboards that have very few RGB lights on them. I think I think the industry as a whole, or at least the the PC building industry is starting to move away. We've also seen some really good coolers that don't have RGB, including one that's on our best list. So I think 2022 may see fewer RGBs.
I'd like to see. I mean, I think we'd all this is not even goes without saying that we'd all like to see graphics cards become widely available at MSRP prices. That would help everything and everyone. So that's not really an innovation. That's just, I don't know, less interest in mining, better production stuff. On the side of new products, I would like to see more OLED in space. There's not been a lot of OLED desktop monitors, and certainly not ones that are affordable. I'd like, considering that we now are seeing so much OLED in the laptop space. We keep seeing more and more laptops come, laptops that aren't unaffordable come with OLED panels on the laptop. I would really like to see some relatively affordable 27-inch or 32-inch OLED monitors.
I think that's going to happen. I mean, maybe not the first half of this year, but I've heard a lot of things about TVs. I think Samsung has been buying starting to buy panels from LG. I've heard, so I think Samsung is placing a little bit less emphasis on LCD, and I
We're
think
also
LG.
seeing like quantum dot OLED displays coming out, which are different from QLED. So and that suddenly like makes OLED no longer top dog anymore. So hopefully that'll mean wider integration. I was actually going to say OLED stuff, so Avram kind of stole mine a little bit.
Oh,
But
sorry.
that's no big deal. I also want to see graphics cards and components in general becoming more widely available because I really want to upgrade my own build. And it feels weird to buy a 20 series at this point. But in the meantime, I'm really excited for the mini like handheld PC space, stuff like the Steam Deck coming out. Before the Steam Deck came out, we saw, cheap handhelds running Android or whatever from companies you've never heard of. We saw like a couple of bigger names like GPD Win and now Neo. Valve is like the first big company that like people who maybe aren't enthusiasts about mini PCs might see doing this. And I would love to see other competitors following suit so that we can get this train moving along farther and get some competition in there to sort of force people to innovate a little bit.
I'm still a bit skeptical about battery life for that, but yes.
I like the idea of it being sort of an in-home streaming like device where you can dock it, pick it up, seamlessly play it, as opposed to like something you take on the plane, or as like an emulator device. But I shouldn't say it that way. But yeah, I said emulator weird. I have a little bit of a cold. If you couldn't tell, I've had a cold this whole show. Avram, it seems like you have something to say.
Oh, I was just going to point to our audience and say, and it runs Linux.
And it does run Linux. That's true.
Yep. Until someone gets Windows running on it.
Although they said you can, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And GPD Win, if you can't tell from the name, is built around running Windows and has been kind of like the leader in that space before the Steam Deck, and maybe the leader after the Steam Deck, depending on how it goes. Valve doesn't have a great track record with hardware. I will say that.
I will say that as someone who wrote stuff in like a popular science magazine for some of their other things that were supposed to be a big deal and then just didn't really happen.
I have a dead bricked Steam Link in my bottom drawer over here that I'm still sad about because it served me really well when I was convalescing over something a couple years ago. And then it broke, and that might be why I got into Raspberry Pis this year, Avram, because I needed to replace that. But it just cost $5 on sale, and now they don't make them anymore, and they won't even RMA it for me. So you are taking a risk with Valve, which is, again, why I want to see people like Asus or maybe even Razer getting into this space and giving people more options.
Who knows? Yeah. I mean, if this sells well, there'll definitely be other companies trying to jump on. So,
well, thanks so much for joining me, guys. Thank you for joining us, audience. You've been great. Thank you for your questions. To see the full best of 2021 article, because we've only been able to cover a few topics here, it is in the description here. It is over on tomshardware.com. And to not belabor the point, we will see you in the new year, starting on the first Thursday of the year at 3 p.m. as always. Until then, Have a great holidays, and we will see you in 2022. Bye, everyone.
Bye.